Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Rishi Gupta. I'm a research fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute in New Delhi. Today, I have with me a very special guest, Mohammed Soliman, to talk on India-Egypt bilateral ties. Mohammed Soliman is the director of the Strategic Technologies and Cybersecurity Program at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. His work primarily focuses on the intersection of technology, geopolitics, and business in the Middle East and North Africa region. He is a native of Cairo and knows the region better and frequently appears on Arabic and English language channels, providing commentaries on unfolding events in the Middle East. So it is great to have you, Mohammed, and thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview.
The pleasure is mine, Dr. Rishi. Really appreciate that you have accommodated the time difference between DC and Delhi.
So, as we see the recent back-to-back visits of Indian Prime Minister Modi to Egypt and Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's visit to India as the chief guest of India's Republic Day celebrations last January, have put the long stagnant India-Egypt relations back in the spotlight. The two leaders are now sure of building a strong strategic partnership, especially when Delhi looks west and Cairo looks east. So, against this backdrop, what, according to you, are the convergences bringing Delhi and Cairo closer to each other?
This is a very fantastic question. So let me take a step back to give a response to some of the questions raised about why it took Cairo and Delhi that long to have that sort of high-level visits. I mean, the last Prime Minister visit Cairo was back in 1997. And I would say Egypt and India went through an era after the end of the Cold War where they didn't really have a strategic vision for what's an India-Egypt relationship should look like in a post-Cold War environment. Meaning 1950s, 1960s, even 1970s, we understand it's non-alignment movement, it's emerging markets, it's developing nations who do not want to be part of the Cold War and a bit skeptical of post-colonial powers in Europe and in the West, generally speaking. So there was a lot of affinity, broadly speaking. And then after the end of the Cold War, it was more of trying to figure out where India is, where Egypt is, what's the interest. I think back to your question, what brings Delhi and Cairo together today is multiple factors. Number one, India is a global power. India is on the rise. Not only is surpassed the UK as the fifth biggest economy, but also is chasing China over leadership in Asia. That means that India will always be looking for more other sub-regions to increase its own influence and assert its own leadership. And I would say the immediate region for India to do that is Middle East for many reasons. But mainly, you have the Suez Canal. This is a focal point for India's maritime interest in the Indian Ocean, connectivity to into Europe and the West generally, as you have seen, as you have said, India is looking west. And three, it's energy. I mean, the Gulf is the biggest exporter of energy to India. So as a country like India that's going through industrialization phase and they're diversifying its own economy, the Middle East playing that sort of role. So this is why what brings India to the Middle East. So what brings Egypt to India? Number one, there's already an existing relationship. You're not restarting that relationship from scratch. There's a trust, an institutional trust between Delhi and Cairo because of the shared history that they had during the British colonialization and fighting the British rule to the Nehru-Nasser era that's very memorable in Delhi and Cairo. On top of that, also, Cairo has its own aspirations and challenges. Aspirations that Cairo right now is surpass South Africa 2016 or 2015 to be number two, the second biggest economy in Africa, and now is chasing Nigeria, which is almost double the demographics of Egypt, to be the number one economy in Africa. So what Cairo needs to be number one economy in Africa is need much more diversified economy, needs IP, needs manufacturing. It already has a manufacturing base, but it needs more because it's a 110 million country. And For Cairo, the affinity towards India is also part of the idea that there is a great power competition that started to make nations very hesitant to pick sides. So, I mean, think about all the hassle that Cairo will get when it comes to Russia or China, or from Russia, China, if Cairo is leaning a bit towards the West. So I think India is more of a middle ground. Like India, it's Korea, it's Indonesia, it's Japan in that sort of sect that Cairo prefers, generally speaking. So this is my long spiel to your fantastic question.
So I'm sure there are grounds where the two are seeking to help each other, and trade and strategic ties being the primary grounds. So, in one of your seminal works, I remember reading in 2021 for the Middle East Institute, uh, you talked about Indo-Abrahamic Alliance. Could you explain what you mean by that? Because it has made headlines. It has been there for last few years, and how do India, Egypt help expand the framework through bilateral cooperation?
So I'm going to explain the Indo-Abrahamic Alliance in few sentences. Indo-Abrahamic Alliance represents convergence of interest between South Asia as a region and the Middle East as a region, ushering a new region that I call West Asia. And this West Asia is everything between Delhi and Cairo. It's a maritime space between the Indo-Pacific and Europe. And that region did not really go through that phase of conversions in the last 100 years. First 50 years, it was more about colonialism. The second half of the century was more about the Cold War, but also regional rivalries, either the Arab-Israeli conflict and also the situation between India and Pakistan. So today, at the time when I wrote the piece, I have seen the writing on the wall that you have economics have shifted, relationships have shifted in terms of finance, business, trade, joint initiatives that transcended all the old political difficulties of the 100 years. Um, and again, even before the I2U2 or the France India UAE summit, when you look into the level of joint investment and flow of investment and people to people ties, that region started to be there, right? I mean, you quite often hear people joking that the biggest city in India is Dubai, right? Or when you talk about the Indian talent in the Gulf, generally speaking, or the convergence of interest between Israel, India on joint defense initiatives and local leadership. And then you had the Abrahamic Accords with the final reason for convergence when you have an actual peace agreement that expanded Israel integration into the region through peace agreements with normalization agreements with the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco. Now we have the Najaf Forum that brings not only the Abraham Accords nation, but also includes Egypt, and in the future, more likely it will include Jordan. So there's a more integration of Israel within its own Arab space, right? So when you add these three sections together, you have a triangle. It's a triangle of relationship. It has Israel, India, the Gulf, and Egypt together. I'm not saying that this is gonna go smooth because there's a lot of differences. However, you know what? We're in a multi-alignment environment. I mean, everyone has differences with everyone, but everyone's trying to be friends with everyone. So I think the current turbulence in global politics also is helping the thesis because people adjusted to the fact you'll never align with another country or another power or another friend or a partner or ally on every issue, right? I'm here in DC. I attended Prime Minister Modi's speech at the Kennedy Center. And again, think about this was a historic visit uh, for an Indian Prime Minister to DC. However, everyone in Delhi and everyone in DC believes there's no full alignment between the United States and India. The two countries are working together when they align, and they aligned in the Pacific, and this is fantastic. So you see defense deals, you see the production of air jets in India, things that were unthinkable 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and now they are normal. So I think back to the Indo-Abrahamic thesis, it's more of a framework to understand that sort of convergence of interest, where these two regions are emerging, are converging into one region, West Asia, and how they're going through a cycle of economic geopolitical integration in the long term. And I would add, and again, I'm sorry that I'm taking a long time here, since the question was more about Egypt, why Egypt is central to the thesis. Because geography is destiny, and the Suez Canal is very indispensable to any sort of understanding of geopolitics in West Asia, generally speaking. And Egypt is not just a country that operates the Suez Canal. I mean, that's not really the case. We're speaking about a country that was able to defend the sovereignty of the Suez Canal against the French and the British in 1956, a country that has the indigenous capabilities to run this canal with its own domestic talent. And they're building the Suez Canal to be its own hub with its own local capabilities as well. And you add to that, they're the biggest Arab military. There are 110 million people. They are also, and I think this is also what makes Cairo very unique and important for India and the rest of the Middle East. It's an Afro-Arab nation. It's not just a Middle Eastern country. It is a North African country. It's a country that was, at some point in the 50s and 60s, a champion of African liberation movement. And today, the country is pivoting back to Africa, not only as a gateway to Africa, but also as a player. So you see the Egyptians building a dam in Tanzania, or they are partnering with Ghana to launch a national airline, or you have the president going to Angola to usher a new sort of partnership, or trying to present a peace at the time, a political roadmap to Sudan earlier this year before the infighting. So it's much more active on the African space. Again, when they hosted the COP28 last year, they hosted the COP28 as an African nation, and they made sure it's an African agenda for COP. So the Africanization of Egyptian foreign policy is also an important component here to think about, because it's a country, again, this is why I said Egyptians are right now thinking about Nigeria in terms of competition, then thinking about Gulf nations in terms of competition, because they see their future and destiny as part of the African continent. And that makes the country a launch pad for, this is why you see all these Korea, Japan, India, trying to localize industries in Egypt, because they're not only benefiting from working with the country, but also benefiting from the African Trade Continental Agreement that Egypt is part of. And it could be very helpful for Egypt and India per se.
In your remarks, I heard two repeated words, which are, I mean, multilateral alliances and differences. Today, in this geopolitical world where competition is huge, I mean, the superpowers are not fighting physically, but there are trade wars and other kind of wars going on. So we see a very rising competition, which is of China's rise. China is seen rapidly raising its regional profile in the Middle East region, similar to what it has been doing around the world. So in Middle East, I think the trade is considerable, and Beijing's strategic quest in the region is the mainstay. At the same time, India too is seeking access to the African and Mediterranean market through Egypt. So, how do you see Indian investment in the Suez Canal Special Economic Zone that you mentioned, and how would it complement China's growing presence?
I would take a voice of dissent here, meaning, unlike India, Egypt is a regional power. It's not a middle power. It's not on a path to be a great power. So the dynamics surrounding Egypt in terms of its own foreign policy is different than the dynamics that India has vis-a-vis China. What I mean by that, like I said, it's a country that has a very specific objective and mandate. We want to grow. We need to diversify our economy. We also have a financial problem in Egypt because as an emerging market, there's a big financial problem that was started with COVID, but then the Ukraine-Russia war did not really help the finances of the country. So they are looking for venues for investment and partnership, and technology transfer and IP transfer. And China is part of it, but it's not really the whole picture. I don't think it's the whole picture. When you look into because also in Cairo, in my viewpoint, Egyptians are also very skeptical usually from great powers who want to exert influence on Cairo. This is why right before 1973 war to liberate Sinai from Israel, President Sadat expelled the Russian experts from the country while the guy literally is preparing for war. You also see that sort of voice of dissent with Washington in terms of the Iraq War and other initiatives. Also, when it comes to the question of China, there is a skepticism I have seen in Cairo in terms of the nature of Chinese investment in other African nations and like what they have seen in Sri Lanka and Uganda in terms of taking over some state assets because the country defaulted its own debt. So in the Egyptian psyche, okay, that means we're going to have certain limitations on Chinese investment and make sure it's very specific. Even though we are in a hard economic times and hard financial times, the Chinese investment is going to be very, very specific in certain industries, and it's not going to be in critical infrastructure or industries that might threaten the Egyptian state or the sovereignty of the Egyptian state. And I'm setting that framework to also lay out what's the nature of the Chinese investment in Egypt. It's not critical. It's not really massive. You will not really see headlines every day about new projects between Egypt and China. This is not really the case. The case is you see more affinity in Cairo towards the middle powers that they feel confident about dealing with, and they feel that they have the history and the shared history, and there's trust in the relationship. So this is why Japan, in my viewpoint, is a very important player in Egypt. There's always a trust in Tokyo. Korea, there's always a trust in Korea. So you have right now, Egypt is talking to Korea about building or rebuilding the shipyards of Alexandria and Suez. And for anyone who's following the Egyptian strategic thinking, these are really major cornerstones to the Egyptian national security and strategic thinking. So just to say, okay, Korea, we're okay with you to do that. This is also indicative about how the country thinks. Even though I can guarantee to you that the Chinese offer could have been much more cheaper, could have been on paper much more cheaper than the Korean offer. However, it's also part of choose your partners wisely because it might reflect on your strategic trajectory. So back to your question about India, I think inviting India to the Suez Canal has multiple factors. Number one is recognition of where India is. So we want to work with India in the Suez Canal because also recognize India's maritime space and maritime interest in the Indian Ocean, which in the Egyptian psyche, the Suez Canal is part of this Indian Ocean system. So that's number one. Number two is also recognition of Indian industry and Indian tech and Indian talent that we want to work together. So recognition of the Indian leadership in pharmaceuticals and tech. And number three, again, is the trust in the relationship. If we're saying we're going to work together on the Suez Canal, which is one of the biggest strategic assets for the country, it's a testament to how Cairo views Delhi in this sort of environment. And finally, it's also multi-alignment, like every single country. I mean, India doesn't want to disagree with the idea of merging the Indo-Pacific and the European theater, which I agree with the Indians on this because they're not really the same theater. This is it's a way for India to say, I don't subscribe to full alignment with the West. Egypt is also having its own version of this, which I want to bring more middle, regional, and great powers to the Suez Canal to work with me on joint projects. This is basically my way forward.
I think something that you say, the trust between India and Egypt is growing, and that is how we see that India-Egypt defense ties are growing. So, how do you see the current state of India-Egypt defense ties, which were indeed the highlight of the Prime Minister Modi's visit to Egypt?
So I know there's a lot of talk about the. I'm sorry. Let me give much more. I'm going to give you context here. So Egypt has about 100 training aircrafts in the Egyptian Air Force, and they're originally Chinese. They're Chinese made, and they were used for training. They're not fighting aircrafts, but they're training aircrafts. And these aircraft, these 100 aircrafts, are about to retire. So the Egyptian Air Force, which is the biggest in the region in terms of numbers, is in the market to look for new training aircrafts. And there are two countries that Egypt is considering. Number one is Korea, and they already signed an agreement for Korea with Korea. And the second country in the market is India with the Tejas fighter light aircraft. But the one common thing about why Korea and India is also, like what I said earlier, is a trusting relationship, but also because Korea and India for Egypt, they're countries that are rising in terms of technology and defense capabilities, and they're happy to share the IP and transfer technology and set up localization plans in Egypt. Because Egypt since 2013, while Egypt was fighting the Islamic State insurgency in Sinai, built some people in Cairo would argue it was not a wise decision for the United States to prevent some sales of military equipment and needed equipment for the Egyptian armed forces that much more tied to conventional capabilities. It's not really about human rights, it's not about anything else. It's literally about Apache and other capabilities that the country needed while it was fighting in the mountains of Sinai against the Islamic State. And that changed the idea in Egypt that we need now to build an indigenous defense capabilities. The country has an indigenous defense capabilities in terms of armored vehicles, tanks, you name it. But in terms of the aviation industry, the country is lagging behind. So the country already exports armored vehicles, tanks, specifically to African nations. You see massive numbers of African delegations and Arab delegations going to Cairo to check either the shipyards, to buy some naval assets, or go to the Arab Organization for Military Industrialization that also has some assets that for land forces. But the aviation industry has always lagged behind. So back to the idea of why this time buying the light aircrafts for the Egyptian Air Force is different, because Egypt is not really in the market to just buy aircrafts. They want to buy the aircrafts, IP, and technology transfer, and they're happy to use their existing military infrastructure and defense infrastructure to be an export hub for these nations for Africa under the African Trade Agreement, and also under the idea that Egypt is expanding its own influence. So the country is positioning itself as a force multiplier in terms of defense industries and defense exports. And this is why I feel if the Tejas deal will materialize, and I think it will materialize, that would be a big major win for India. Because not only India will sell the 25-35 aircraft to Egypt, that's of course a material win, but I think the other layer of this win is you're going to have this partnership with Egypt, you're going to export your own Indian fighters that are produced in Egypt to other nations who are willing to explore other kind of defense capabilities from nations like India. And there's that sort of aspect I think is going to be transforming the India-Egypt military ties.
So it's going to be a win-win situation for both Egypt and India. And I think the defense and strategic cooperation opens up gates for the two countries to exchange ideas, thoughts, and technology. So with this, we'll conclude this session. And thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview. We'll be happy to have you again for another event. Thank
The
you so
pleasure
much.
Rishi, and I really appreciate that you took the time to speak with me while it was nighttime in Delhi. So I really appreciate you. That was a very thoughtful conversation, and looking forward to come back again to speak with you.
It's a pleasure having you. Bye-bye.